A Chinese company paid hundreds of millions of dollars to lease an Australian port. For years, nobody cared. Then the port started making money. And suddenly, everyone wants it back. What changed? And what happens if Australia tears up the deal? Picture this. It's 2015. A small government in Australia's remote Northern Territory is quietly drowning in debt. Its main port, the one meant to be the gateway to Asia, is hemorrhaging money, infrastructure crumbling, shipping volumes embarrassingly low, no private investors knocking on the door. So they did what any cash-strapped government does. They put it up for sale. More than 60 companies from around the world threw in bids. The winner? A Chinese company called Landbridge Group, which offered a price so high it stunned even the officials running the auction. A 99-year lease, approved by federal authorities. No formal objections from national security agencies. Deal done. Fast forward 10 years. Landbridge has pumped more than $1 billion Australian dollars into that port. New facilities, deeper shipping channels, modern cargo systems. And in the 2025 fiscal year, for the very first time, Darwin Port turned a profit. You'd think everyone would be celebrating. Instead, the Australian government is now talking about taking it back. And Beijing? Well, Beijing is not happy. This is the story of Darwin Port. A story about money, power, and the uncomfortable truth that in the 21st century, the line between a business deal and a geopolitical flashpoint has almost completely disappeared. To understand why Darwin Port became the center of a diplomatic firestorm, you need to go back to a moment when nobody was calling it strategic. Nobody was calling it a national security concern. In fact, in 2015, the main thing people were calling it was a problem. The Northern Territory government was in serious financial trouble. This is a vast, sparsely populated territory in Australia's tropical north, a place bigger than France and Germany combined, but home to fewer than 300,000 people. It has always relied heavily on federal funding and commodity revenues, and by the mid-2010s, those revenues were falling short. The Port of Darwin sat at the heart of this fiscal headache. Its infrastructure was decades old. Shipping volumes were nowhere near where they needed to be to make the facility viable. Every year it operated, it cost money that the territory simply didn't have. The government's solution was straightforward: privatize. Launch an international bidding process, attract global capital, and let private money solve a public problem. What happened next surprised almost everyone involved. The interest was enormous. Over 60 firms from across the world entered the bidding. Infrastructure funds, logistics giants, sovereign wealth vehicles, they all saw something in Darwin that the Northern Territory government hadn't fully appreciated at the time: strategic geography. Darwin sits at the top of Australia, closer to Jakarta and Singapore than it is to Sydney or Melbourne. It straddles some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, the sea routes that carry trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. For any company serious about logistics in the Indo-Pacific, Darwin was an attractive piece of the puzzle. Landbridge Group won the bid. The Chinese private company, founded by billionaire Ye Cheng and based in Shandong province, secured a 99-year lease for a price that exceeded what most analysts had projected. The deal was formally reviewed by Australia's federal government. Security agencies were briefed. No formal objections were lodged. Cabinet approved it. The deal went through without so much as a murmur in the national press. Think about that for a moment. A 99-year lease on critical port infrastructure handed to a foreign company, and it barely made the news cycle. Why? Because at the time, nobody saw it as anything other than a routine commercial transaction. China was Australia's largest trading partner. Chinese investment was welcomed across the country, in agriculture, mining, property, and energy. The idea that a Chinese firm buying into a loss-making port in the remote north would one day become one of the most politically charged issues in the country would have seemed almost absurd to most observers in 2015. But the world was about to change, and it was going to change fast. For several years after the deal closed, Very little happened. Landbridge quietly got to work. The port needed serious investment, and serious investment takes time. New berths were constructed. Dredging operations deepened the shipping channels to accommodate larger vessels. Cargo handling infrastructure was upgraded with modern automation. Cold storage facilities were added to attract agricultural exports. The workforce expanded. Local contractors were hired. The community around the port started to feel, for the first time in years, that something real was happening. According to estimates reported in Australian media, Landbridge's total capital expenditure surpassed $1 billion Australian dollars over the decade following the lease. That is a significant number, especially for a facility that had been written off as commercially marginal just years before. The results were tangible. Freight volumes climbed steadily. New shipping routes were established. Northern Territory cattle producers found new export pathways. Mining companies gained more competitive logistics options. And by the 2025 fiscal year, the turnaround was complete. Darwin Port recorded its first full-year profit. A Chinese company had taken a failing Australian port, invested heavily, endured years of thin margins, and finally built it into a viable and growing commercial enterprise. Under most interpretations of how international investment is supposed to work, that would be called a success story. But by 2025, the strategic landscape looked nothing like 2015. In the years between the deal and the profit announcement, almost everything had shifted. Australia had experienced one of its most turbulent diplomatic periods with China. Trade tensions had flared dramatically after Canberra called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Beijing responded with a series of targeted trade restrictions, imposing tariffs and informal bans on Australian exports including barley, wine, coal, timber, lobster, and beef. The economic pressure was significant and deliberate, a message sent through commercial channels. Those tensions eventually began to ease after a change of government in Canberra and sustained diplomatic engagement through 2023 and 2024. But the experience had left a mark. It had exposed just how vulnerable Australia was to economic coercion from its largest trading partner, and it had accelerated a broader policy rethink about strategic dependencies. At the same time, the security environment in the Indo-Pacific was intensifying. China's military capabilities had expanded substantially. Its assertiveness in the South China Sea had grown. The relationship between Beijing and Washington had hardened into something that looked, to many analysts, increasingly like structured rivalry rather than competitive coexistence. Australia responded. Defense spending climbed. The AUKUS partnership, announced in 2021, committed Australia to acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, a decision that fundamentally redefined the nature of the Australia-US alliance. Rotational deployments of U.S. Marines to the Northern Territory became a fixture. The Tyndall Air Base, not far from Darwin, was upgraded to handle advanced U.S. aircraft. Darwin's military significance, already notable, was amplified. And suddenly, the port looked different. Not because the port itself had changed, but because the neighborhood around it had. Darwin Port had not acquired any military functions. It remained a commercial facility, containers, bulk cargo, livestock shipments. But its proximity to expanding defense infrastructure, combined with the broader deterioration in Australia-China relations, meant that the political optics of a Chinese company sitting on a 99-year lease a few kilometers from a U.S. Marine base had become deeply uncomfortable. In geopolitics, optics matter as much as facts. Section 3. The political turn. The 2025 federal election changed the conversation entirely. Darwin Port had been hovering in the background of Australian political debate for several years. A 2021 federal review had considered the lease. A 2023 national security assessment had examined the arrangement again. Neither review had produced findings of concrete security breaches or legal violations. But, neither had fully extinguished the political concerns either. By the time campaigning began in earnest, sovereignty over critical infrastructure had become a genuine wedge issue. Lawmakers from both major parties, Labor and the coalition, were competing to sound tougher on foreign control of strategic assets. The port was, honestly, a ready-made symbol. After the election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made his position clear. During a visit to Darwin in late January 2026, he publicly stated that his government was seriously considering reacquiring the port. The message was not vague. He framed it as a matter of national interest. The argument being made, openly, was that infrastructure of strategic importance should not sit under foreign ownership, regardless of whether the current operator had done anything wrong. That last part is worth dwelling on. The Australian government was not alleging fraud. It was not claiming that Landbridge had breached the terms of its lease. It was not presenting intelligence showing that the port had been used to surveil U.S. military movements or interfere with Australian defense activities. The case being made was essentially this: the asset is important, and we would rather own it ourselves. From a purely legal standpoint, that argument is complicated. Contracts carry obligations. When governments sign agreements with private investors, foreign or domestic, those agreements create enforceable rights. Revoking a lease without cause or without paying meaningful compensation exposes governments to arbitration, damages claims, and long-term reputational consequences in global capital markets. From a political standpoint, however, the argument had genuine resonance. Public opinion polls in Australia consistently showed majority support for returning strategic infrastructure to Australian hands. The idea that a port in the nation's north, so close to military facilities, so central to trade routes, was operated under a near-century lease by a Chinese company made many Australians uncomfortable. That discomfort is real. It deserves to be taken seriously, and no one in serious policy circles is dismissing it. But the timing creates its own problem. When the port was failing, when it was a drain on public finances, when no Australian investor wanted to touch it, it wasn't called a national security priority. It was called a liability. The moment it turned profitable, it became a strategic asset. Critics on both sides of the political aisle, and several prominent economists, have pointed to that inconsistency with some frustration. It raises an uncomfortable question. If Landbridge had continued to lose money, would anyone be pushing to reclaim the port at public expense? Section 4. Beijing responds. China's reaction to Australia's signaling has been measured but unmistakable. The Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, did not mince words. His public statement warned that if the lease were terminated unilaterally, China would take steps to protect the legitimate rights and interests of its companies. The language was careful, diplomatically formulated, but the message was not subtle. This was not a routine commercial dispute. This was a political matter, and it would be treated as one. Beijing's framing has centered on a single principle: the sanctity of contracts. The lease was granted through a transparent international bidding process. Australian federal authorities approved it. Security agencies were consulted. No objections were raised. Landbridge invested $1 billion on the basis of that agreement. To revoke it a decade later, not because the operator violated its terms, but because political circumstances had changed, would set a precedent that China considers dangerous. And here is where the argument gets genuinely important, because Beijing's concern extends well beyond Darwin. Chinese companies have invested heavily in infrastructure around the world. Ports in Greece, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, and dozens of other locations. Mining operations across Africa and South America. Energy infrastructure in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Telecommunications networks on multiple continents. If governments can tear up long-term agreements with Chinese operators once those investments prove successful, the risk calculus for Chinese outbound investment changes fundamentally. Either Chinese firms stop investing in assets that might later be reclaimed, or they invest only in markets where political risk is minimal, which increasingly means markets with authoritarian stability rather than democratic unpredictability. Neither outcome serves the broader goal of open, rules-based global commerce. Beijing is sending a signal, not just to Canberra, to every government that hosts Chinese infrastructure investment. Contracts matter, and if they stop mattering, there will be consequences. Section 5, the economic tightrope. Here is the dimension of this story that rarely gets adequate attention in the political debate: Australia's profound economic exposure. China has been Australia's largest trading partner for well over a decade. The numbers are not close. Across iron ore, liquefied natural gas, coal, agricultural products, and education services, China accounts for a staggering share of Australian export revenue. Iron ore alone, the rock dug from the Pilbara region of Western Australia, generates tens of billions of dollars annually, and the overwhelming majority goes to Chinese steel mills. For all the rhetoric about diversification, no alternative market has emerged that can absorb anywhere near that volume. The senior figures in Canberra who understand trade understand this better than anyone. Behind the public bravado about sovereignty and national interest, there are serious and nervous conversations happening in Treasury, in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and in the offices of state premiers who know exactly how much their budgets depend on Chinese commodity demand. A dramatic move on Darwin Port could trigger responses that go well beyond diplomatic cooling. China does not need to escalate militarily or impose formal sanctions to make Australia feel economic pain. It has a far more subtle and effective toolkit: administrative delays at customs, increased inspection requirements for Australian imports, informal guidance to state-owned enterprises to source from alternative suppliers, strategic shifts in procurement to Brazil or Africa for iron ore, targeted anti-dumping investigations, formal dispute proceedings at the World Trade Organization. None of these are dramatic. None involve overt confrontation, but collectively, they can be devastating. Australia experienced a version of this between 2020 and 2023, when Beijing's trade restrictions cost Australian exporters billions. The sectors affected, barley, wine, coal, lobster, timber, were disrupted for years. Some never fully recovered. The prospect of repeating that experience, but this time deliberately and as a direct response to Australian government action, is not one that serious economic policymakers in Canberra treat lightly. And yet, the political pressure is real. The alliance expectations from Washington are real. The public sentiment is real. The national security debate is real. Australia is caught between two very large gravitational forces: its economic lifeline and its security anchor. And the Darwin Port dispute is where those forces are pulling in opposite directions. To properly understand what is at stake, it helps to zoom out and look at the broader strategic landscape in which this dispute is unfolding. The Indo-Pacific has become the defining theater of great power competition in the 21st century. The United States and China are engaged in a structured, long-term rivalry across trade, technology, military posture, and diplomatic influence. Both are actively courting allies, shoring up partnerships, and seeking to shape the regional order. Australia sits squarely in the middle. The AUKUS partnership, the tripartite security agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, represents the most significant shift in Australian strategic orientation since the Cold War. The commitment to nuclear-powered submarines is not merely a defense procurement decision. It is a declaration of alignment. It tells the region and the world which side of the strategic divide Australia has chosen. That choice comes with benefits: deep intelligence sharing, access to advanced military technology, the reassurance of the world's most powerful military alliance. It also comes with costs. Costs measured not just in dollars, though the submarines will be extraordinarily expensive, but in the complexity of managing relationships with regional partners, particularly China. Darwin is central to this picture. The Northern Territory's geographic position makes it a critical node in U.S. military operations across the Pacific. The Marine rotational forces based there, the enhanced air facilities, the proximity to key sea lanes, all of this means that Darwin's strategic profile has grown immeasurably since 2015. The port sits in this context. It has no direct military function, but its location, so close to defense infrastructure, so central to regional logistics, means that its ownership has taken on symbolic weight that goes far beyond its commercial operations. Whether or not a Chinese firm operating a commercial shipping facility actually poses a concrete intelligence risk is, in many ways, beside the point. The optics of the arrangement have become politically untenable in Canberra. And in politics, perception often drives policy just as powerfully as evidence. This is not unique to Australia. Across the Western world, governments are revisiting foreign investments in sensitive infrastructure with a scrutiny that would have seemed excessive a decade ago. The United States has tightened its processes for reviewing inbound investment through the Committee on Foreign Investment. The European Union has developed new screening frameworks. The United Kingdom has introduced national security reviews for acquisition of strategic assets. Australia is not an outlier, but it is confronting this challenge in a particularly exposed position, given its economic dependence on the country it is most worried about. Something important has shifted in how China approaches overseas investment disputes. Understanding that shift is essential to grasping what makes this situation different from previous episodes of commercial friction. In the early years of China's overseas investment expansion, roughly from 2000 through to the mid-2010s, Beijing generally adopted a patient, accommodating posture when disputes arose. If a project ran into problems, Chinese firms would negotiate quietly. They would accept delays, absorb losses, and prioritize the preservation of long-term diplomatic relationships over short-term commercial outcomes. There was strategic logic to this. China was building its global footprint from a position of relative newcomer. Being seen as a reliable, low-drama partner helped open doors. Avoiding confrontation helped smooth the way for future projects. That logic is eroding. By the mid-2020s, China is no longer a newcomer to global infrastructure investment. Its companies are embedded in critical assets on every inhabited continent. The Belt and Road Initiative has channeled hundreds of billions of dollars into ports, roads, railways, energy networks, and industrial zones across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Chinese firms are not seeking entry into global markets anymore. They are already there. And as that presence has grown, so has Beijing's willingness to defend it. The shift is not driven by aggression. It is driven by a straightforward commercial and strategic calculation. If Chinese overseas investments can be expropriated or canceled without meaningful consequences, every time political winds shift in a host country, the entire overseas investment strategy loses coherence. The risk premium demanded by Chinese capital will rise. Future investments will be structured more cautiously. The strategic diversification that global infrastructure investment provides will be compromised. China's leadership has watched what happened in Sri Lanka, where debt-driven port deals attracted enormous international criticism. It has watched the narrative around Hambantota and other projects be weaponized to cast Chinese investment as predatory and destabilizing. It has seen deals revised, canceled, and renegotiated under political pressure across multiple continents. Darwin represents a different kind of test. This is not a case of debt trap concerns. Landbridge paid Australia. This is not a case of a poor country being exploited. This is a commercially successful investment, legally obtained, being targeted for repatriation because it has become politically inconvenient. From Beijing's perspective, that is precisely the scenario that demands a firm response. Not an aggressive response, a firm one. The message being sent is measured but clear. We play by the rules, we expect others to do the same, and when they don't, we have tools. Inside the Australian government, the conversation is considerably more nuanced than the public debate suggests. There are essentially two schools of thought in the corridors of power in Canberra. The first school argues that sovereignty must come first. Australia's critical infrastructure, ports, telecommunications networks, power grids, water systems, should be under Australian or trusted allied ownership, full stop. The fact that a foreign company from a country with which Australia has a complicated and sometimes adversarial strategic relationship controls a significant port in the nation's north is simply not acceptable in the current environment. The cost of reacquisition, financial and diplomatic, is the price of policy mistakes made a decade ago. The second school argues for pragmatism. It acknowledges the national security concerns. It accepts that greater scrutiny of foreign investment in sensitive infrastructure is warranted, but it counsels caution about the specific step of revoking a legally binding lease. That action, it argues, sends a signal to all foreign investors, not just Chinese ones, that Australian commitments are conditional. It undermines the credibility of Australian commercial law. It invites economic retaliation at a moment when Australian exporters are still recovering from the last round of trade tensions. Between these two positions, the government must also manage alliance expectations. Washington has been clear, in diplomatic messaging,